Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as I share some common winter sowing mistakes. So let's go. It is the middle of January and I've been busy doing a lot of winter sowing. In fact, I've been making a lot of videos on how to winter sow and different plants that you can winter sow. What I can do is down in the description below, I can put a link to a playlist of all my winter sowing videos in case you're interested. And those videos include reveal videos from previous years. As a reminder, I live in New Hampshire. I garden in zone 5B. Based on my zip code, my average last frost date is around the middle of May. And while I'm chatting with you today, I'm going to be potting up some spring bulbs. It's not too late for me to be doing this project, believe it or not. I won't be going in any particular order, but I'm going to start with winter sowing and sowing seeds at the wrong time. A lot of sources will tell you that the best time to start winter sowing is around winter solstice, and that usually falls around the end of December. And that's a great guideline to follow. However, it's really going to be dependent on where you live. That guideline is for the Northern Hemisphere, and also that guideline is a general guideline. If you live somewhere where it's very, very cold, like I do in New Hampshire, I might be able to winter sow even a little bit earlier than that date. However, if you live somewhere where it's much warmer, you might have to actually wait a little while after the winter solstice. Basically, you want to start your winter sowing as soon as the coldest part of your winter has arrived. And for us here in New Hampshire, it is absolutely January and February. Those are our 2 months when it's the coldest. Now the key is when it comes to starting your winter sowing process, timing is everything. You don't want to start too early, and I'm going to tell you why. Let's say that you started a bunch of seeds in some sort of a container outside for winter sowing, but you started them too early and you're experiencing some nice warm weather and those seeds germinate. But then cold winter hits. What's going to happen is most likely those plants will die. You don't want to start winter sowing too early. But on the same token, when it comes to timing, you also don't want to winter sow too late. And one example of that would be with perennials, let's say, when you're sowing your perennial seeds. There are definitely a lot of perennials that don't require what's called a cold stratification period. But there are a number of perennials that actually do require a cold stratification period. That period of time is also known as vernalization. And certain plants require a longer period of vernalization or cold stratification. So if you're not giving those plants that require a certain period of time that proper vernalization period, there's a chance that those seeds might actually not germinate. And that's why you'll see in my videos recently that I'm only planting perennial seeds. I want to make sure that I'm giving those seeds the proper amount of cold that they need. And I definitely don't want to run out of time. I'm going to wait for other seeds, but for right now I'm just focusing on my perennials. A general guideline that I follow is about 5 or so months before your average last frost date. That's about when you can be planting those hardy in your zone perennial seeds. Because again, those are typically the plants that might need that cold stratification period. And then sometime around 3 or 4 months before your average last frost date, that's usually when you can plant the more cold hardy type of annuals. And some examples of those type of annuals would be annuals that like to reseed themselves very readily where you live. And those annuals might be different than the cold hardy annuals that reseed readily where I live. So I'll share some that reseed readily in my yard, but keep in mind they might not in yours. Some of them would be pansies or violas, also calendula, and even Lebanon mist. So those are all plants that are annuals. They're definitely not perennials, but they come back for me year after year because they self-sow very readily in my area. So those would be considered cold hardy plants in my growing zone where I live. So after I'm done planting all my perennials, those are the type of plants I'm going to go after. And when you are buying seed packets, if you see those words, if you see something like cold stratification, or you see the words self-sows or self-seeds readily, those are good indicators that those are nice plants that you can winter sow earlier in the season. Now, about 1 to 2 months before your average last frost date, that's about when you can start winter sowing your more tender annuals, things that prefer warmer weather, things that would not do great if they got hit by a frost or a freeze. You want to be winter sowing those types of plants near the end of your winter sowing period, which some people actually refer to that sometimes as spring. Instead of winter sowing, they refer to it as spring sowing. But I will be transparent and I will share with you that I've never experimented and I've never winter sown an annual that is not hardy in my zone in December or January to actually say whether or not it would work. I just know that I have plenty of other plants that I'm sowing anyway. So for me, it doesn't make sense to sow like my marigolds right now or my zinnias right now. And I also think it's worth sharing that when I'm talking about all this timing, that it really is important because you're watching my videos, maybe you're watching other people's videos, or maybe you've been reading some blogs or things along those lines. It's so important to know when you're watching a video or you're reading a blog where that person lives, because you don't always want to just be following everyone and what they're doing when it comes to seed starting, be it winter sowing or starting seeds indoors under LED shop lights or grow lights. You want to make sure that you know your area where you live and use a lot of these sites as help and guidance, but definitely be starting seeds appropriate to your climate and your growing zone. The next mistake people make is sowing the wrong amount of seeds. So this one is an interesting one. You're going to hear people tell you, don't sow too many seeds in your container. You're going to hear other people tell you, sow the seeds very thickly, very heavily in your container. I'm going to tell you, do what's best for you. You know yourself better than anyone else. If you don't want to have to deal with a whole ton of plants that you're going to have to thin out and pot up or put into your garden beds, then honestly, it's probably better to sow on the lighter side in your containers. But if you're like me, I have a backyard plant nursery, plus I have my own flower gardens. I'm apt to sow very thickly in my containers because I want to maximize that space and I want to get as many plants as possible. However, it is really important, especially if you're going to sow very thickly in a container, that you make sure that you're thinning out or pricking out those seedlings and either potting them up or putting them out in your landscape about when the first set of true leaves appear. And the reason you want to do that is if you just let those plants stay in that container for a very long time, the plants are going to suffer. They're all competing for nutrients, for water, for sun, for air. So you want to make sure that you're taking care of thinning out or transplanting all those seedlings pretty soon after they get their first set of true leaves. Another instance where I would sow very thinly inside of a container would be a plant that generally is hard to transplant. Maybe it has a long taproot. So some examples of those would be poppies, balloon flowers, sea holly, butterfly weed, lupin, which I think a lot of us love. But basically any plant that, if you have heard or you're reading that it specifically says it does not like to have its roots disturbed or that it has a taproot, in that case, I would go and just plant very thin, very small amount in your container. Because once it comes time to getting those plants out of the container, you don't want to disturb the roots too much. The next mistake people make when it comes to winter sowing is not protecting their containers. Protecting the containers if you know that it's going to be very cold. That's very important. For any of those plants that are tender in your area, you want to make sure that you are giving those plants proper protection as the plants start germinating. And what I mean is there might be a chance that you get freezing temperature, a frost or a freeze. You're going to have to protect those plants. I've never grown anything other than perennials using the winter sowing process. This will be my first year experimenting with plants that are not perennial in my area. And I'll be starting those later, like I mentioned. And I can definitely show you during that time what I do if cold weather is coming. But at least right now, I want to tell you that you want to be on the lookout for that. and you want to protect those. I know a lot of people end up losing their plants that they were winter sowing because the plants got hit by a frost or a freeze. You can try and you can lay a comforter or a heavy blanket and protect your containers that way. If it were me, I'd probably prefer to just bring them into an area that's warmer just for the night or just for the day to protect them. And it really depends on how cold it's going to get. The other mistake that a lot of people make when it comes to protecting their containers is not taking care of them in terms of the wind. So if you place your containers out there and a big windstorm comes in and knocks them over or blows them around in the wind, what might happen is now the container is not getting the proper moisture coming into it, like water or snow, because maybe you have a milk jug that fell over. So you want to make sure that you're protecting all those little seedlings or the seeds that are inside of that container by picking up your milk jug or whatever has blown away and put it back straight up so that it gets the rain or the snow that it needs. And you also are doing that because you don't want those seeds that are inside there to dislodge and move around. And one way you can protect your containers from the wind is when you place them out there, you can basically get them nested close to each other, and then you can put some sort of a fencing or something around them so that they're not blowing around. A common mistake that happens with winter sowing is not sowing the right kind of seeds. Now, when I say right kind of seeds, you might hear some places tell you that you just need to be using the best quality seeds out there. That's really a personal preference. It's up to you. I've had a lot of luck just sowing a lot of the seeds that I collect myself. I've also had a lot of luck with seeds that I've bought online from various sites. I've had a lot of luck winter sowing seeds that I've bought at big box stores. So it's really up to you and your budget on how much you want to spend on your seeds. But when it comes to sowing the right kind of seeds, what I will say is it is important to sow the correct kind of seeds. And this especially is true if you live in an area that has a shorter growing season, like I do. I mentioned earlier that my average last frost date is the middle of May. So because of that, it is not a great idea for me to winter sow something like peppers or eggplants, asparagus, bulbing onions, basically plants that take a long time to grow from seed. Another example might be something like a pelargonium, which is like a geranium. I've never experimented with it. I haven't tried it. To be honest with you, I don't care to try it. I'm almost confident it would not bode well for me if I was to winter sow peppers. But for you, it might be a different case. You may live in a warmer area, you might have a much longer growing season, and you may be able to get away with winter sowing, something like a pepper plant or an eggplant. I mean, I definitely would experiment with it if I lived in an area with a much longer growing season. I mean, it doesn't hurt to experiment with trying some winter sowing of peppers outside and also growing some pepper seeds indoors under your grow lights. And the same would probably fall true for certain flowers, by the way, at least for me. I love to grow impatiens. I love to grow wax and tuberous begonias. I know they take a long time to grow from seed. I just wouldn't even bother trying to winter sow those. I would just grow those indoors as well. The next mistake that's quite common is not making or providing the proper amount of drainage holes in your container. You might be using a container and it has a few drainage holes, but it might not be enough. I would prefer to have a little bit more than less when it comes to drainage holes. But I will caution you on that in a minute. So going back to drainage holes, you want to make sure that you're providing good drainage for the plants that you're trying to grow. You don't want those plants to be waterlogged. You don't want the roots to rot. You want to make sure that water is properly draining out of your container. It's much better, healthier for your plants. But along those same lines, I will tell you a personal story. It has to do with also don't use containers that have too many drainage holes in it. And the example I'm going to give is when I first started winter sowing, probably 3 or 4 years ago, I was using whatever container I could get my hands on. We eat a lot of blueberries, we eat a lot of strawberries, and so I was using those type of containers also. And usually you'll find them at like Costco or Sam's Club or any grocery store usually. And in the bottom of them, they have a ton of little holes that are there. What I found was the water was draining way too much from those containers, and then my soil was drying out way too quickly. I was constantly watering the plants, and I was wondering why why was it always drying out? So you want to make sure that you have enough drainage holes in your container, but you also don't want too many drainage holes that it's totally drying out your soil. The next tip is letting things dry out. So you can imagine you planted all these seeds in the winter time, you've waited this long, finally you see those little specks of life, which we all love to see. And if you're new to winter sowing, you wait, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It's like Christmas, opening up a Christmas present each time you open up a milk jug or a container. And you are so excited, so happy, but now you got to water all these containers. And if you're like me, you might have 30, 40, 50 containers going on. It's a lot of work to water all of those. But remember, these plants need a lot of water. And if you're not watering them, they're going to die. So don't fall into that bad trap. Be on the ball with watering those containers. For me, where I live, the milk jugs that are outside are frozen right now. And they're going to be frozen through January, through February, and then they'll think about thawing out sometime in March. And you might plant some seeds that I plant, and yours will start sprouting before mine do. And it really just comes down to those seeds are going to sprout whenever they're ready based on our different climates. But yes, with all that effort, you don't want your plants to dry out. So be on top of it. Don't expect Mother Nature to help you out all the way, because there might be days or weeks that you don't get any rain during the springtime, or in the wintertime, even where you live, you might not be getting any rain, you might not be getting any snow. Your containers might not freeze where you live. Make sure that they're not drying out. You want to keep them well watered, but not too watered. The next common mistake has to do with labeling. First of all, don't forget to label, because once you plant all those seeds out there, you're not going to remember what's in all your different containers. Unless, of course, you're just doing one container, then maybe you don't need to label it. But most likely, if you're winter sowing, you're doing more than one container. So labeling is extremely important, because once the plants start coming up, sometimes you can tell what the plant is. Like if a lupin came up, I would know it's a lupin. But generally, most of the plants, you won't know right away what they are. So you want to make sure you're definitely labeling all your containers. And not only do you want to label them on the outside of your containers, you also want to label them on the inside, especially if you're using something like milk jugs and you're using the duct tape. The duct tape might fall off, or the pen might wear out that you're using. So you want to make sure you're adding a label on the outside as well as the inside of your container. I like to use a garden marker. I used to use Sharpies way back when, and I found that the Sharpies didn't work out well. They would wear out. So I like to use a garden marker. I know some people like to use painter's pen as well. So whatever you can find that you know will be able to do fine out in the elements, you want to be able to use that. The next common mistake has to do with picking the wrong container. I like to use milk jugs, and the milk jugs I use are translucent. There are juice bottles, for example, that are clear that you can use, but my word of caution on that is, since they are clear or they let a lot of light in, they're definitely going to get hotter inside. They're definitely going to heat up your mini greenhouse quicker. So keep that in mind. It's okay to use it, but they're definitely going to get your seedlings much warmer inside. So you have to be right on top of it. Personally, I just like to use something like a milk jug that has a translucent look to it. It's just a little bit, stays a little bit cooler in there, so I prefer that. And the general guideline is you want there to be enough soil inside of whatever container you use. I say in a lot of my videos 4 inches. Honestly, it really depends on what you're growing in your container. And the big thing is, whatever you're growing in your container, You just want there to be enough soil for all those seedlings that you're putting in that container. And especially if you're heavily seeding your container like I am, I want to make sure that there is a good amount of soil in there to support all those little seedlings that are in there. And again, I mentioned earlier, I had made some rookie mistakes when I first started winter sowing. I didn't have enough like milk jugs on hand, so I would use containers that really could only hold maybe 1.5 inches or 2 inches of soil, like those restaurant to-go containers. I would use those for winter sowing. They're not optimal. They don't hold enough soil, so you definitely want it to be able to hold more than that. And also when it comes to picking the right container, just make sure whatever container you use, and again, it doesn't have to be a milk jug, it could be a tote, it could be a juice bottle, there's so many things. It could be a Ziploc bag. You just want to make sure whatever you're using is clean. You don't want to be carrying over any sort of disease or fungus to your little seedlings that you're trying to grow. The next common mistake is planting your seeds incorrectly. Some seeds require light to germinate. Some seeds require darkness to germinate. So as you're winter sowing, you want to make sure that you're reading your instructions very carefully. And you want to make sure that if the seed requires light to germinate, that you're just barely pressing it into the soil surface. And if the seed requires darkness to germinate, then definitely research it and see, is it telling you that it needs to be buried 1 inch deep or 2 inches deep? So make sure you're reading the instructions on that, because not every seed is treated the same. In case you're wondering what these are called Glory of the Snow. I had dug a whole bunch of these out from my landscape, and I'm putting them in the top layer of my pots. It's an experiment. I want to see how they look. I'm curious. I actually don't remember if they're going to bloom first or if the tulips are going to bloom first or what, but I just figured it's a fun thing to do with all of these little small bulbs that I have. Another thing I wanted to add in terms of planting the seeds correctly is making sure that you're pressing the seeds into your potting mix. You want to make sure that the seeds are making very good contact with the soil. You don't want them to be moving around, to be dislodged. So no matter if they're surface sown or if you're having to plant them 1/2 inch or 1 inch deep, regardless, just make sure that you're pressing down and making good contact between the seeds and the potting mix. I think it's good for me to share a lot of my rookie mistakes, because when I started winter sowing, I didn't research it enough. And one of the things that I did wrong was I had put some of my winter sown containers under the eaves of my house. Don't do that. You want to make sure that your containers, no matter what container you're using, has access to rain, has access to snow. That's how you're going to get the water to come into your container. So you want to make sure that your containers are not placed under something like your eaves or under a covered porch, or somehow where they're not getting that rain and snow that they need. Also, when it comes to placing the containers in the wrong location, some would argue don't place your containers in the sun. Others will argue don't place your containers in the shade. I'm going to tell you it's going to vary for each one of us, and it depends on where you live and your climate. Where I live, it's pretty cold, and our springs are pretty cold, pretty slow. I feel really comfortable putting my milk jugs out in the full sun. The first year that I ever winter sowed, I put all my milk jugs on the north side of my house where it's pretty shady. And I found that it took a long time for plants to wake up. And that didn't really work for me. I wanted my plants to wake up quicker than that. And also I was worried that the seeds were going to rot because they were getting too wet in the spring and they weren't getting any sun to dry out the soil, even though there were drainage holes in the bottom of the container. So then all the years after that, I've only put my winter sown containers on the south side of my house where it gets full sun. And I found that that works better for me. Now, where you live, maybe you live in an area that you don't have much of a spring, and maybe it gets really, really hot. So it might be better for you to put your winter sown containers in a little bit more shadier area. Or another option is you start off with full sun, and if you're finding that the containers are drying out too quickly and that you're watering them all the time, then you always have the option of moving them into a shadier location. In fact, as spring ends and as we get into summer, if I haven't taken care of all my winter sown containers, then even I will move my containers into a shadier location just so that they're not getting too hot and so that I'm not watering them as often. Another common mistake is using the wrong type of soil. A winter sown container is kind of like a pot, like this is. You want whatever's in here to be well draining. You don't want it to be too heavy. You want to make sure that the plants that are in here can breathe, that they're not going to rot. So therefore, potting mix is a really good choice for you. You don't want to use something like native soil, native earth. That's definitely going to be too heavy. You also don't want to use something like seed starting mix. That is going to be too light. Now, some people do say that the reason you don't want to use seed starting mix is that there's no nutrients in it. I will tell you that I only use potting mix that I've made myself, and there are no nutrients in it. And the plants that I grow, I feel, are very good, very healthy, very strong plants. So personally, I don't think I need to have the fanciest, nicest potting soil for my winter sowing projects. I just need it to, I want to make sure that the plants in here have soil that's well draining, because I'm going to be fertilizing them, not a lot. I'll fertilize them once they have their first set of true leaves. But after that, I end up pricking out the plants and I can put them out in my landscape or I can pot them up. So I don't worry about the fact that there's no nutritional value in my potting mix when I winter sow. But again, it's up to you. You can use whatever you feel comfortable with. I just wouldn't recommend seed starting mix, and I definitely wouldn't recommend native soil. And in regards to the potting mix, I also wouldn't recommend potting mix that has the water retention in it, because if you have that, you may run into problems where it's retaining too much water in your container, and you don't necessarily want that. So I wouldn't get the potting mix that specifically says it has those water retaining aspects to it. Another common mistake is not paying attention to the temperature. You really want to be watching the temperature. Once your plants start sprouting, if you're going to get a frost or you're going to get a freeze and you have plants that can't handle it, you're going to have to protect those plants. When it comes to my perennials, honestly, my perennials usually do not sprout for a long time. And even if they did, once they do germinate, they're hardy in my area. I've never had a loss of perennials, but I'm talking especially about those annuals that are not hardy in your area. Those are the guys that you definitely want to keep an eye on and protect. So when it comes to those cold nights, if it's going to be just slightly cold but not a freeze, you can just close your milk jug. You don't want to just worry about the cold. You also want to worry about the hot. So if it's going to be a very hot day, then you want to open up your containers. You absolutely want to open them up. You want to make sure that those seedlings are not frying inside of your containers, because if that happens, those seedlings will die. You don't want it too hot in there, because it will, for how small those little greenhouses are or containers are, they get hot very quickly. But then you also now have to then go back and close your containers if the night times are going to cool down. So it's really a balance act for a while to make sure that you're really babying your seedlings during the spring months when it's going to be very hot during the day or very cold at night. The next mistake that a lot of people make is transplanting their seedlings at the wrong time. So in the springtime, we get itchy, we're looking for things to do. We see life inside of our milk jugs and we think, hooray, it's time to now prick out those seedlings and pot them up or get them out in our landscape. But the problem is we're taking these little seedlings that are all nice and comfortable in their little greenhouse and we're putting them out in the elements. And that's all great until a frost or a freeze comes. Now you're stuck protecting all those plants that you just took out of their container and you're having to protect them. Or worse yet, you forget to protect them and then they all die. So definitely pay attention to your temperature. You might see someone else on YouTube taking their seedlings out of their container and potting them up or planting them out. And you might think, oh, it's time for me to do it too. Not necessarily. So just make sure you're watching your own temperature, look at the 10-day forecast, watch, the temperature carefully, and do it with caution, especially for those tender plants. And as I say a lot of things in this video, I'm always going to play devil's advocate because there's always two sides to each of these stories. So yes, you don't want to plant out your seedlings too early. You also don't want to plant out your seedlings too late. If you wait too long, there's a chance that your seedlings get stunted. Or let's say that you have vegetables that you're growing. Maybe it's too hot in there for the lettuce or those cool weather crops, and now they're not going to do well. They're going to get stunted. Or you might have some annuals like marigolds, and if you had taken them out and put them out in your landscape or in a pot, they could have bloomed for you. But because they're stuck inside of their container still, they're not growing as fast. You might never even see a bloom on the poor plants. So you also don't want to wait too long to take your plants out of their container. So I usually like to watch the weather, especially if it is going to be those tender type of annuals, and that's when you would want to start planting them out. And the other thing I look for when I'm taking plants out of their container is I like for the plants to have at least one set of true leaves on them. One thing that's easy to forget is not fertilizing your seedlings. Now it could be that the potting mix that you used when you did winter sowing already had some fertilizer in it. So then it's probably not a problem. But even then, remember, every time you're watering a container or a pot, just like a pot like this, a lot of the fertilizer gets leached out. So it's important to be fertilizing those seedlings, especially after they get their first set of true leaves. And you can use whatever fertilizer you feel comfortable with. It could be a liquid fertilizer, it could be a slow release fertilizer, whatever you usually use, there's no right or wrong with that. But I will say that when it comes to something like the liquid fertilizer, especially if it's a synthetic liquid fertilizer like Miracle-Gro, just make sure you're not doing it at full strength. It's no different than when you have seedlings inside that you're taking care of and fertilizing. You want to do it at half the strength. And then the final mistake, although this one is, I'm going to call it, it might not be a mistake, it's just something to know. We use the word winter sowing, but in fact, there's also something called spring sowing. So just know that. You might be sowing seeds in milk jugs, but it's actually done during the spring. So you can still call it winter sowing, or you can call it spring sowing. They can be used interchangeably. But typically, winter sowing is done during the winter, and spring sowing, even if the method is the same, is called spring sowing. So those are all the common mistakes that I could think of based on my own personal experience and based on just hearing from a lot of other people. And I hope that you found this video helpful. I'll definitely be making more videos on winter sowing, and please follow me along with the process because I'm going to be showing you what comes next once the plants come up. If you have any questions or comments, please drop them down in the comment section below. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.